what do we got going on today? Well, today we're going to check out what does it take to make a bourbon. And I just chose bourbon because I love bourbon, right? Everybody knows that. Well, basically there's 4 processes that we need to do to make bourbon, and each one of them processes has many steps in it. So we're going to try to touch on this. We're not going to go into great detail, but a little bit, okay? So the 4 processes, we can't change them at all. That's just the way it is. We have to do it. Okay, but the steps, we can tweak them to your own likings, whatever you feel the best. You know, that is where everything is customizable, and you can make your own spirit, and it is yours and nobody else's. Okay, but first, welcome to Stillworks and Brewing. My name is Randy, and this is a channel that's all about home distillation and brewing. Okay, so process number 1, mash. You gotta have a mash, right? Okay, so so that is the first process. So what is some of the steps within that process we need to do? Does that make sense? Yeah. Okay, well, very first thing is we either got to develop a recipe for ourselves, or if you have a recipe that you found, whatever the case may be. But let's kind of develop our own recipe, okay? Well, first you got to know the rules. Okay, the rules of bourbon. Now, granted, this is, I shouldn't say rules, this is more like guidelines, because as a home distiller, you can do whatever you want to do, you know? Alright, but here's the rules, and I ain't even sure who come up with these rules. Okay, so rule number 1 is the mash has to be at least 51% corn. What else? It has to be aged in a new white oak barrel. It can't be distilled any higher than 160 proof, and it can't go in the bottle any less than 80 proof. Alright? So that's the basic rules, and they say it has to be made in the United States, but like I said before, we do what we want, right? So, like you guys in New Zealand, if you want to make a bourbon, you make a bourbon, right? Okay, so what ingredients we want? Well, number 1, we know we got to have corn, okay? I like to use barley because I want the diastatic power in barley to help convert that corn. I think we all put a little bit of wheat in there because I feel that wheat, it adds a type of smoothness to bourbon to me. I mean, especially like a wheated bourbon, you know, a heavy wheated bourbon. Oh, whew, fantastic. But this is more of a standard bourbon. So I'm going to put some wheat in there, just to smooth things out. And then I always like to put a little bit of rye. Hey, rye is a little peppery tasting to me. It just adds a little bit of spice on there, okay? So it's all personal to you. So you choose what you like. But overall, you do need corn and you need barley. And you could do with that or whatever, like I said, whatever you like, okay? Okay, so let's make our grain bill. This is a grain, what I'm considering the grain bill is the percentages of the grain that you want to use in your bourbon. Okay, I'm thinking, well, number 1, we need corn. So I'm going to go with a 60% of corn. Barley, I'm going to go with 20%. Wheat, I'm going with 10%, and I'm going to put 10% of it is going to be a rye. Alright, so what we're going to do now is let's figure out how much we're going to need, okay? So we're going to go to my chart and we're going to fill it out just so we can figure out what we need, okay? So let me get set up and then I'll be right back. Okay, so here's my chart. Let's figure out I already filled it out, but I'm going to show you how I come up with everything. Okay, so the target we're shooting for is 1.090. Okay, so that is our target, what we're shooting for. So if you just drop off the 1 point and just drop that off. So 6 times 90 is 540 target points. Okay, now if we can't usually get 100% of brew house efficiency, it just don't work out. So let's say our brew house efficiency, we figured that we're like at 85% is what we normally get. So if we take the 540 times the 85%, that's going to equal 459. Okay, so we take that number, put down there. Okay, the 500, well, remember the 540, that goes here first, I'm sorry. Okay, so 549 goes there. The 540 target points that we got, minus the 459 from there, our brew house efficiency adjustment is going to be 81 points, okay? So the 540 plus the 81 adjusted points equals 621 adjusted points. Okay, so now the way I usually do it, I always take an average. So here's your corn, your barley, your wheat, and your rye, and these are the max points that we're going to get out of, you know, the PPGs, points per gallon. Okay, corn is usually around 30, barley is about 35, wheat's going to be 37, and rye will be 29, which equals 131 points. We divide that by 4 things, so our average is, let's say 32. We'll round it down to 32 points. Okay, so we got our 629 adjusted divided by 32. So it looks like the pounds we need is going to be 19.4. Okay, so that's how many pounds we're going to need to get this whole thing done. So ingredients: corn, barley, wheat, and rye. Since we did an average of all that, it is 19 pounds. So let's start with corn. Corn is 19 times 60% of the mash bill, grain bill. I'm going to round it down to 11. The barley, about 20%, I just rounded that up to 4. Wheat, which is 10%, it's a 1.9. We just rounded it up to 2, and the same thing with the rye is 2. So this is what we need to buy. We need to buy us 11, well, we're going to use 11 pounds of corn, 4 pounds of barley, which I'm going to go with 6 row. Wheat, I'm going to go for a nice white wheat, 2 pounds, and the rye, 2 pounds. Okay, and if you add that up, that is 19 pounds of grain. Alright, and that should get us close to 1.090. If it's a little less, that's okay. Oh, and one thing I did, yeah, and it's a 6-gallon mash. We're making 6 gallons of mash. Okay? I hope I explained that okay. I'm going to rework on this chart to make it more self-explanatory. But it does the job. Okay? So now we know how much grain we need to have on hand. Okay, it's time to mash in. Okay, so the very first step that we're going to do in mashing in this mash is we're going to take in our mash tun or in a pot, whatever way you do it, is we got to cook our corn because we are using regular yellow dent corn, you know, milled, and we need to cook it to get the gelatinize it to get the starches out of that corn. Okay, now if you're using a flake product like flake corn, you don't really have to do this step. But anything that is not cooked, let me back up. If anything is not flaked, you need to cook it. Okay. So what we're going to do is we're going to take our corn and we're going to mix it with hot water to about, and we want to maintain 190 degrees for about an hour and a half. Okay. Then after that, the temperature is going to drop down. Once it drops down to about 60, let me back up a little bit. At that point in time, at the 190, you can use a high temperature enzyme to help break the corn down too. So you could add that at that time. But if you're not, once it gets down to about 160 degrees, we can add in our malted products, like your malted barley, your malted wheat, and your malted rye. Because the enzymes in them three products will start to convert those starches over into sugars. Okay, and how long will that be? Usually about, I go for an hour 15 to hour and a half. If you go a little longer, it will not hurt it at all. So that is going to start converting all them starches over into sugars. All right, so after that, the next step is we'll do a starch test with iodine to make sure that the conversion did take place. If it hasn't, maybe you could leave it sit a little bit longer, or whatever the case may be, maybe add a little bit more enzyme if maybe you didn't have enough, or whatever the case may be. But the starch test is going to tell you when it's done. Okay. All right. So after the starch test is done, and we confirmed that all the conversion did take place. Okay, I'm gonna sparge all my grain. Now you can do this two different ways. You could either take the grain and everything and ferment on the grain. That's perfectly great. A lot of people do it that way, and you'd move on. Or the way I particularly like to do it, I like to sparge my grains to wash all them sugars out of them grains, put it over in my fermentation bucket, and so I'll wash them grains, and once I collect up to my 6-gallon mark in my bucket, I got my mash and I'm getting ready. Alright, so at that point in time, I'm going to check my pH to make sure, we really want to make sure that our yeast is nice and happy. We all love happy yeast. Okay, so adjust your pH, or your pH, that's a crane. Adjust your pH to about 5.4 to 5.2 to 5.4. If you need to raise your pH, towards the more basic side or base side, I think you add baking soda. If you wanted to go to more acidic, you can add lemon juice or citric acid, and you just adjust it till you get your 5.4. So after that, we will check our starting gravity. Now this is one thing that a lot of people forget, but it's very, very, very important. It is really important. We want to make sure that we got sugar in that mash, right? So take yourself a hydrometer reading. And in this particular case, we're looking for a 1.080 to 1.090. I don't particularly like to go over 1.90 because I think it just stresses the yeast out a lot. So that's what I'm shooting for. So then after that, once the temperature of the mash is below 90 degrees, I can add my yeast. I use Daddy's yeast, and I usually use right around 2 tablespoons. Okay, then I'll put it in my fermentation room and let it do its thing. Okay. Okay, so we've done our mash. That's process number 1. Now we're going to move to process number 2, and that is called fermentation. Okay, so what is fermentation? That is, I feel silly telling you this, but fermentation is basically the process of the yeast consuming the sugars, and the byproduct of that is alcohol and CO2. I have found that after adding the yeast, it takes, 1 to 12 hours to get started, or not get started, but start to see the signs of fermentation. Okay, so what is the signs of fermentation? Well, the activity can be rising bubbles in the mash, or if you're using an airlock, you'll see bubbles in the airlock. And that's just indicators something's going on. But you know, something that is cool, if you have a clear fermenter, you can see all kinds of activity going on in that fermentation. It's pretty cool. There's a lot of stuff going on. Okay, so then after 7 to 10 days, you'll start seeing all them activities slowing down or stopped. And now's the important thing. How do we know when fermentation is done? The only surefire way to know that fermentation is done is use a hydrometer. You put a hydrometer, it should read somewhere in the neighborhood of, most of the time it's 1.000, and sometimes it goes down really dry is 0.999, okay? And if it's, let's say it was at 1.010 and it stayed there for 3 days and never changes, well, I would say it's done. Okay, but I found most of the time with Daddy's yeast, it's going to go down to 1.000. All right. Now the next question I've got a lot: how soon do I have to run that mash? How soon do I gotta have? How much time do I gotta have to run? Hey, alcohol is one of the best preservatives out there. It will not hurt to stay in there as long as it's, and I like to say it needs to be sealed up to keep the oxygen out. So as long as the oxygen is not gained to it, it'll stay there for a long time. Don't worry about it. Alright, so now the next question we have: how much alcohol is in that fermentation bucket? Okay, one way to figure that out, if you take your starting gravity, see, starting gravity, minus your final gravity, and you times that by 131.25, that equals your ABV, alcohol by volume. Alright? Alright, well that's the first two processes. Alright. Okay, go get yourself something enjoyable to drink, and then we're going to come back and do part 2 of this video. Okay, we'll see you soon.